Hey there, VisualPolitik community. I don't think I have to convince you that something has changed in recent years. The era of wars has returned.
It's not just Ukraine and Gaza. War is on the rise everywhere. An authoritative new study finds there are 183 regional and local conflicts underway in 2023, the highest number in 3 decades.
Russia invading sovereign countries in the middle of Europe, threatening others with a nuclear bomb, and claiming that Latvia does not exist. Iran is using puppet organizations to attack one of the world's main trade routes in the Red Sea, and to turn the Israel-Lebanon border into a pressure cooker. The war in Gaza, or the 1001 conflicts that have flared up once again in Africa. And take note, because as we already told you here on VisualPolitik, a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO on European soil seems less and less far-fetched. This is at least the opinion of numerous governments and intelligence services in Europe.
Russia could attack a NATO country within 3 to 5 years, Denmark warns.
The point is that, given this possibility, let me ask you a question. To what extent do you think Europe is preparing to defend itself in the event of having to fight a direct conflict with Russia? I am referring, of course, to waging that war without the help of the United States, as the Republican candidate Donald Trump has threatened on several occasions. Well, if you've seen any of the videos in which we have talked about these issues, such as the video in which we told you about the decrepit state of the German armed forces, I think it seems pretty easy to come to a conclusion. Possibly not. And yes, let's see, in the long run, Europe would prevail by budget, industrial capacity, resources, technological level, etc., etc. However, the current precarious situation of the armed forces would make the effort and the cost immense. In fact, it is likely that if such a situation were to arise, everything would soon end up at a negotiating table, where perhaps Europe would not come out particularly well, despite being superior to Russia. And the problem is that this could encourage the Kremlin to pounce on EU territory, possibly in Estonia or Lithuania. VisualPolitik community, this is precisely what has begun to worry many European leaders, and that is forcing them to make a move. But late, very late, as is now typical in old Europe.
The year 2024 will be the first time that European NATO allies spend 2% of their combined GDP on defense expenditure, according to NATO's latest figures released on 15 January 2024.
The reality is that the European defense industry has been lagging behind for decades, and most European countries have a worrying underinvestment in defense and equipment. And obviously, given this situation, we on VisualPolitik have asked ourselves a few questions. Why is the European arms industry so much more stagnant than, say, the US one? How is Europe trying to revitalize it now? Will they really be able to do it? Well, fire up your engines and let's get started.
An industry lagging behind.
The defense sector has been experiencing a sort of golden age since the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. That was an event, a turning point that made many countries begin to see that perhaps a peaceful Russia integrated into the international community was more a wish than a reality. And so defense investment began to grow again almost everywhere in the world, and with it the revenues of arms companies. In fact, from 2014 to 2019, the revenues of the 100 largest companies in the sector globally grew by 36%. Of course, this did not happen across the globe equally. While the large contractors in the rest of the world shot up their revenues by almost 50% during the same period, the large European operators stagnated at around $100 billion. They lost 7 points of market share globally. In other words, while the big titans of the US and Asian military industry were winning contracts, the Europeans were struggling to keep up with their numbers from 5 years earlier. And obviously, the question is, why did the large military groups in Europe lag behind? Well, there is no single answer, but rather a combination of factors. One of the main reasons for this particular situation is perhaps nationalism on the part of European states when awarding arms contracts, with the excuse of national security and boosting local industry, generating jobs at home, and all that we usually hear from politicians. European countries tend to buy their weapons as close to home as possible, except in very specific cases. This may sound good to many of you, and it is true that on paper it may make some sense. However, it also has significant trade-offs. And yes, I know what you're going to say. The United States almost almost always buys military equipment from its own US industry, an industry that, thanks to that habit, is by far the most advanced in the world. The problem is that we're talking about companies that have to invest heavily in machinery, technology, and product development. And of course, a single European country, such as Germany, Italy, or Spain, is not the same when it comes to spending on its local defense companies as the United States. Uncle Sam alone accounts for a higher GDP, while having only 3/4 of the population of all the countries of the European Union combined. Therefore, when comparing, it would be more correct to see the United States as an entire subcontinent and not just as a single country. This, coupled with the fact that they also spend much more on defense than Europe, allows them to order much larger volumes of military equipment and supplies from their industry on a regular basis. Thus, while all European states combined spent just under $480 billion on defense in 2022, the United States spent about $800 billion. In other words, practically twice as much. With all this, it is not surprising that the US arms industry can generate very large economies of scale. And not only that, unlike European companies in the sector, American companies are assured of constant and very long-term contracts. And this translates into sufficient funds to invest heavily in research, development, and innovation. So how can they not be at the forefront of technology and development of weapons and equipment? In that sense, they have everything to gain. In other words, fragmentation plays a key role in explaining the gap between the European and US military industries. As European companies are smaller and have more limited markets, their ability to develop advanced equipment and maintain large operational production lines is also much more limited. Without large purchase volumes, with small, irregular, and widely spread out contracts between dozens and dozens, hundreds of local companies, little can be done. In order to solve this problem, European countries should abandon nationalism when awarding new military contracts and stop buying from a company simply because it is local and use more technical criteria. And as proof, a fact, of the 10 largest companies in the world that manufacture armaments, 6 are American, and there is only 1 European, the British BAE system. The other 3 are Chinese, for obvious reasons. There are 1.4 billion people, and in the last decade, they have increased their defense spending by 63%. The fact is that this fragmentation has an even more undesirable effect. European arms companies, even some of the leading ones, such as Italy's Leonardo, France's Thales, and Germany's Rheinmetall, simply cannot have a catalogue that offers complete defense for the states that contract them. That is to say, in order to cover many types of armaments such as air, land, maritime, and other capabilities, meaning that, for instance, France can sign a multi-million-dollar macro contract for very different systems than the United States does. Not to mention the fact that France would never be able to order contracts from its companies in the volume that the United States orders from its own. Then, at the same time, this fragmentation means that military equipment is very different from one European country to another, both in terms of performance and price, even if they follow NATO standards. And that, not surprisingly, is also a problem on the battlefield. Now, many of you may be thinking that this can't be the whole story. After all, a country as small as Israel has a huge and advanced military industry. Well, yes. That's why we told you that we can find more problems. The third that we can identify has to do with the type of spending they do. You see, in 2021, for example, the combined spending of all EU member states on military equipment accounted for 18% of total defense spending, a percentage that falls far short of the 35% target. And what does this mean? It means that too much of Europe's defense money is channeled into inefficient salaries and structures, and too little into arms procurement. And that, obviously, is also a factor that decapitalizes the European defense industry. Even so, then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly everything changed. Since then, it seems that the drift of Europe's arm industry has completely changed course. But how exactly is it doing it? Well, let's take a look.
Europe trailing behind.
There is nothing that gives companies more incentive to innovate, produce, and develop new products than the desire to make money. It's just the way it goes. So far, we're not discovering any secrets. It's basically how the market works, and obviously, the defense industry is no exception. Well, with this in mind, in recent years, the European Union has tried to put on the table some programs to strengthen the regional defense industry, but when it comes down to it, they have been so insignificant that they seem to have been created more to keep up appearances, and to be able to say that something is being done, rather than to try to improve the situation. Do you think I'm exaggerating? Well, here's a revealing fact. The famous European Defence Fund, which is a fund to, in the EU's own words, foster competitiveness and innovation capacity in defence, has a budget of 8 billion euros over 7 years, a little more than 1 billion euros per year. This is for the entire defence industry in Europe. To give you an idea of the insignificance of this investment, it is barely 0.4% of the annual defence expenditure of all the countries of the European Union. 0.4%! And as it is clear that this is not enough, now that things are getting tight, they have come up with a new strategy. At least this one might be a little more promising.
First ever European defense industrial strategy to enhance Europe's readiness and security.
The European Defence Industrial Strategy, or EDIS, is a plan to support member states and their arms industries. The cornerstone of EDIS involves creating a joint and steady demand for defence equipment by EU states through long-term joint procurement programs. And well, the truth is that this has a negative and a positive side. The negative side is that it entails centralizing decisions in the European Commission itself, something that could generate a lot of debate and even a block by some member countries. In fact, some are already calling this idea a little Soviet. Take a look.
The Commission doesn't have to incentivize this. Governments will place orders, defense companies will invest in capacity and sell their stuff. That's how market economies work. There's no need for this style of planned economy.
What's more, the idea, following the initiative presented by the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, is that this plan will be launched with 100 billion euros in its pocket, money obtained by issuing Eurobonds, and which would finance joint purchases among the member states. This is something that for now, Germany and the Netherlands oppose.
The Netherlands is not in favor of issuing new common debt. Financing defense expenditure is not a crisis response, but a policy response to structural challenges. Therefore, the use of common debt is not the most obvious way.
The downside is that putting tons of common money on the table could mean, as is often the case with EU money, that member states end up spending money for the sake of spending, without really paying much attention to the equipment they actually need. Nevertheless, the idea also has a very positive side. Since the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 3/4 of the defense purchases made by the EU states have been from outside the EU, and the United States alone is taking 63% of all this new multi-billion-dollar money flow. In other words, at a time of maximum need for weapons, the European arms industry is once again being left out of the game, basically because they cannot provide what the European states need. And not only that, since spending money on buying arms from other countries does not create jobs at home and does not stimulate technological and industrial development in Europe, it is very difficult for politicians to justify or make a profit from the increase in military spending. So, what is the problem? Well, in the end, this spending always ends up being pushed into the corner by politically more attractive items. To address this, EDIS states that at least half of the procurement budget of member states must go to suppliers based in the EU itself, and by 2035, that percentage must grow to 60%. And on joint purchases, it is established that at least 40% of defense equipment purchases have to be made jointly. But why do we say that this could be a good thing? Well, because, if well executed, this plan would allow larger, longer, and more consistent contracts to come to the European military industry. This will allow these companies to have a higher revenue forecast and be able to invest in developing more and better technologies. The idea is to take advantage of the serious shortages of equipment and ammunition in Europe to try to prevent the vast majority of the purchases that need to be made from being taken by countries outside of Europe. As we have told you, this is what has been happening so far. And yes, many of you will think that this sounds like blatant protectionism, and it is true, but the military industry has a very particular set of characteristics. On the one hand, it's a very capital-intensive industry, and on the other, it depends entirely on public budgets, not on the market. Be that as it may, it seems that in Europe, things are slowly starting to come together. It has taken a war on the continent, and a direct threat, but it's a start.
Rheinmetall forecasts record sales amid Europe's changing threat situation.
Yet there are some points of concern. For example, is 1 billion enough to cover the defense shortfalls that almost all European countries have? Will all countries ultimately agree that 60% of military purchases will be made jointly? VisualPolitik community, with the threat from Russia and the possible return of a profile like Trump to the White House, someone who's already said that he would not send military to fight in the event Russia attacked any NATO country in Europe. What is clear is that Europe has to get its act together. Will it happen? Well, as always, we will be here on VisualPolitik to tell you all about it. But until then, the questions are for you. Do you think that centralizing a large part of European military procurement in Brussels is possible? Do you think that this is the only way for European defense companies to grow? Leave us your opinions here below in the comments. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so. Once again, thank you for being there. All the best. See you next time.